going to try to make this particular session as interactive as possible. I'm going to try to keep our panelists to the time allocated, and then invite, after each section, we'll have 3 sections, participation from the audience to ask questions to our panelists. So we'll do this over the 3 sections for the questions. So the first question that I'd like to ask our panelists today is the following. What are the challenges and opportunities in implementing the new international education standards? And the first question I'll pose to Edward.
Good afternoon and welcome back after lunch. As David alluded to, I served until this month as a member on the Accounting Education Standards Board, and I was appointed as a non-accountant. I first make that confession. And I was appointed as a public interest member and consider myself as a bit of an activist in defending the public interest when it comes to the work of professional accountants. David, 3 challenges and 2 opportunities. The first is the challenge of enforceability. I think that having set the standards, ultimately the power or the value and the ultimate impact it will have will depend on the extent to which it can be enforced. And enforcement has this ironic and counterintuitive phenomena in that if there's one area where it cannot be enforced, then it renders the entire system weak and places the integrity of that system in place. So I think PAOs, member bodies, would need to consider how they would enforce these new set of standards. The second is we live in a world where there's significant disparity between a number of various organizations and other providers and stakeholders that should deliver on the ultimate new standards, finding its root and ultimately having its impact. And one of the challenges we have grappled with in the second phase of our work following the development of the standards is in fact how can we address those disparities, and we address that later on in the session today. And the third is implicit in the way that the standards have been developed. There are 8 standards, David referred to them earlier on, and they were developed as separate standards, and the challenge is to then allow that to be synthesized and integrated so that there's not rote learning of separate standards, but rather the ability to assimilate and to synthesize separate standards into a coherent level of mastery by the individual. So those are some of the challenges that I believe we will have to bear in mind as we go forward. In terms of opportunity, 2 opportunities. I think the one is because it's a learning's outcomes approach, principles-based, it does allow for the recognition of prior learning. It also allows for multiple different streams that can arrive at the same destination because it's the outcome or the destination that is important and not necessarily the journey or the route there. As I said, it's an outcomes-based approach. And then I think the second huge opportunity, which I think the accounting profession collectively is challenged with, is to ensure that this new set of standards are sufficiently socialized to become the global benchmark for accountants. And whilst it's directed at the member bodies of IFAC, one would implore that it's socialized and there's a general outreach to ensure that its impact is more broader so that ultimately its value is felt in the profession. Thank you.
Wolfgang.
Thank you, David. As David mentioned, I'm here today as a representative that is a member and secretary of the Common Content Project. This is a project to harmonize education, accountancy education, at a European and worldwide level. That being said, that means that there are 10 institutes currently involved. There's one more, David, that we forgot to mention, is Belgium, just joined recently, and 7 countries. So I have to provide the following caveat that what I'm saying today may not necessarily represent the views of all of the institutes and represent my views. But of course, I will be drawing on the perspectives that I've received working over a decade on the Common Content Project. With respect to challenges and opportunities, I think there are a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunities. I think one of the big challenges is the legal and regulatory environment. You'll find that when there are laws and regulations dealing with accountancy education, they're invariably input-based. And this is not going to change in the near future. So one of the challenges will be to reconcile an output-based approach with an input-based regulatory framework. Another is, of course, institutional. Most education providers are still on an input-based model. Some are moving towards or have moved towards output-based models and emphasize competencies more. But I think there's another challenge here to essentially have educational institutions move towards a learning outcomes approach. Another challenge is how do we deal with a learning outcomes approach with respect to practical experience? How do you measure practical experience in an outcomes-based approach? It would require as well changes to curricula. You need detailed learning outcomes and other matters which we will discuss later. And I think the final challenge is assessment, and I think Edward alluded to this. That's part of enforceability. And I think this is something that's going to require a lot of professional judgment, both by those designing the programs and those testing to see whether they actually work. With respect to the opportunities, as Edward mentioned, there's greater pathway flexibility. It doesn't matter what route you take, as long as you get there, because it's outcomes-based. And this means, from a common content point of view, greater opportunity for transnational cooperation on professional accountancy qualifications, because you're never going to harmonize education delivery systems at an international level. There's too much law, tradition, and culture that gets in the way, but you can harmonize learning outcomes. There's one final point which I think is really important, and it's market-driven. I think using a learning outcomes approach and a competency-based approach permits better alignment of the competencies needed for the needs of the profession and the public. Thank you.
Adrian, do you have a view on this?
Thank you, David. Well, accounting education, it's where we all started, isn't it? And in a way, these few days here in Rome, it's where we're continuing. Because what better continuing professional development for all of us than engaging here at the World Congress with thousands of other like-minded professionals from around the world. And the way I see the new international education accounting standards is as a real sign of a transforming and maturing profession. No longer are we going to be in the business of didactically instructing our aspiring professional accountants in very detailed, input-driven terms about what they should be engaging with. No, we're moving towards a more mature professional relationship as professional accounting organizations with our students and with our members, where we work more broadly in partnership to determine the competencies required for their chosen field, to design professional syllabuses based on those competencies, which are structured through detailed learning outcomes that can then be properly assessed through one or other of the assessment mechanisms that David explained to us earlier on. And a number of professional accounting organizations are already grasping that challenge and taking responsibility for some of those changes. And if I might reflect just for a moment on some of the work that I've been doing, where, for example, we're faced in the UK with a whole new legislative framework for the audit of government financial accounts. And we've taken that as an opportunity to work alongside the developing new education standards, to work with government and the public services on the competency frameworks required for people analysing and assessing those historical financial statements of public sector organisations, and to build a whole new framework of learning outcomes and assessment strategies in order to measure them. And to get there, whether we're looking at the private sector or the public sector, we've really got to listen to our markets as professional accounting organisations And our markets are wider than just the members of our institutes. They're governments, they're companies, they're the regulatory community, they're the major accounting and audit firms, and we need to work in partnership with them and use that opportunity to mature and transform the profession. Because I think we shouldn't make any mistake about it. These new educational standards provide us with the conceptual clarity which in my view has been missing from accounting education for a very long time, that takes us all the way from those competencies, what it is we need to do in our work, through the learning we need to undergo to achieve those competencies, through very clearly and closely aligned assessment frameworks in order to do that. So I find them incredibly exciting, and I think they can only help us as the profession moves forward.
Jerry?
Representing the educational side of this process, I think, is very much part of my role here. I think the complexity, the challenges in implementing the IESs particularly, is that interface of the various parties, the regulators, licensure organizations, regulations, who have the regulations on the profession, member bodies who may be professional oriented for the profession itself, and then the educational providers. And the challenge is finding the avenues, collaborative platforms, opportunities to bring all those parties together to work towards a common implementation of buying into what the IESs are addressing, and to incorporate in that, of course, an assessment process, which is not well established even internationally in any context. It's an emerging activity in many countries. Some countries have very mature quality assurance programs for higher education and so on. But building in truly outcomes assessment based on competencies is new territory for many. So the relationship of those parties is an opportunity, but it's also a challenge. And depending upon the current strength of those relationships, which are social, geopolitical, a whole host of things make up those relationships. The strength of that now, or how it can be strengthened going forward, will be really the essence and test of how we can get progress made on these.
Thank you, Jerry. At this point, we're going to stop and we're going to ask the audience if they have any questions, clarifications. We can take 2 or 3 questions right away.
Richard Johnson from Public Finance International, which is the international news website of SIPFA's membership publication, Public Finance. I just wanted to kind of expand a little bit on what Adrian was saying about the public sector work that's ongoing, and to ask the panel to what extent the new standards have reflected the lessons of the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis in recent years, and to what the impact of them has been on the standards that have been created.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that question, which, as I understand it correctly, is to invite the panel to reflect on whether or not the new standards would have assisted with the sovereign debt crisis, which we've been living through since 2007, 2008. Now, moving slightly outside the education standards, of course, there's recently been a very fascinating study undertaken of the Greek government's debt position, which reveals that if the Greek government had been using the international public sector accounting standards, its debt position would in fact be better than the UK's, my own country. And so I think that shows as an example that the international standards that IFAC supports the development of do have a real and material impact on the position of states, governments, and sectors around the world. As far as this relates to education standards, and speaking as a representative of a public finance body, the challenge for me, in order to make sure that the new education standards really do help people involved in government finance, avoid perhaps some of the misreporting of government debt and deficit positions which we've seen in the past, is to ensure that the content of our curricula and of our CPD activities reflects public sector accounting standards in addition to IFRS standards and different types of standards relationships, so that those differences can be reflected. Because until we get governments properly reporting on an accruals basis, just as companies do around the world, we won't be able properly to assess the performance of states in terms of the management of their finances on a like-for-like basis. And I think it's critical that accounting educators grapple with that challenge, understand it, and realise that they have to build it into their curricula as they work to design their new syllabuses. I know that's a tough call. I know it's a tough call, but not as tough as what so many people have been living through in the world as a result of that poor reporting, or what might happen in the future if it happens again.
I think very quickly 3 points. Firstly, yes, it was taken into account. 2, it manifests in some of the attributes that is required, that seeks to amplify beyond the technical competencies what are the other strategic and critical behavioral competencies, and specifically around the ethical orientation, the values. And I think that is an acknowledgement that none of those failures happen necessarily because of technical deficiency, but more because of the latter too. I think the third point is that one must resist the simplistic view that fixing accounting education will fix the corporate failures. I think that's a hugely complex world. As I said, as David said, I represent a business. I'm a user of education, of the financial and non-financial reporting. And later on, we will talk about where else one has to look to address those corporate failures.
Any of the other panelists? All right, we have time for one more question. Yes.
My name is Sebastian Owama from Nigeria. Please bear with my ignorance. I am assuming that as we have come here to be educated on the new education standards, one would expect the high points of the new education standards as against the previous standards before we start talking about the challenges and the opportunities. Part of education is knowing what education is all about. I don't even know the new education standards set side by side with the old education standards. I want to be educated. That's why I came in here. Thank you.
Does any of the panelists want to speak to that? Sure.
I'd invite our questioner, who raises a very important point there, to study, if he has the time, the information that IFAC provides on its website about the development of the new education standards, where there's an awful lot of detail and comparative information set out there that enable you to put the standards side by side, see where the changes are, see the challenge that your institute, your professional organization, your training body is being given in terms of adapting. Now that's a little bit longer than probably we've got time for this afternoon, but I would encourage that as a very important thing. If I might make one very high-level point, however, about the standards, and perhaps here I'll reflect just on IES 7 and IES 8, the two continuing professional development standards, which of course are the ones that most of us in this room, I'm assuming, will be interested in rather than initial professional development. And that is to say that we have now been given the professional respect and the professional freedom to identify our own developing professional competencies going forward, to map our own professional learning over a period of time in order to meet those criteria, and in a way by which we can satisfy ourselves as professionals, our employers, should we have them, and the regulatory environment within which we work. And that's the professional transformation that I was referring to at the beginning. So I would encourage people to take this opportunity as a real professional transformation moment in the life of the profession.
Yes, I'd like to answer the question a little more directly. I think We have, what, 2 hours approximately?
No, 90 minutes.
90 minutes, so it should be less. I don't think anyone can teach you the new standards in 90 minutes. The function today, I think, is more a case of sensitizing the audience as to where the issues might be to help you deal with the standards when you try to internalize them. But I don't think it's something we can do in 90 minutes.
We have time for one more question. Yep.
Thank you, Muhammad from Nigeria, Annan. My major problem is how much of this education is actually the responsibility of the IFAC and PAOs. From what you are saying, the initial education is handled by some other bodies. Initial accounting development program. How are we going to make others that are not part of this collection to now appreciate these standards and utilize them for purposes of building on the other standards 7 and 8?
Thank you.
That's an excellent consideration, and one that we reflected on as a standards board when we thought about a new strategy and work program. And very implicit in that is the acknowledgement that it's more than just the member bodies of IFAC that would have to work together in order to allow the standards to have its full impact. And so the next phase of the work of the standards board is in fact not about developing more standards. It will keep an ear open to the ground to see whether there's a need for more standards. But primarily, the focus for the next few years will be about building capacity, about outreach, about advocacy work, about being more inclusive as to the recognition that other stakeholders like service providers, regulators, and other professional bodies all have to collaborate more than ever before to allow those standards to finally have its impact.
David, may I?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the parties involved, there are a lot of tertiary parties as well, and I think you allude to those, not only the educational institutions, regulatory bodies, professional bodies, but you get into providers of accounting educational materials. As we refer to book publishers, whoever else, but there's a lot of players in this set who need to come on board to help us, because I'm a member of the academy. Let's face it, what gets put in textbook materials is what a lot gets taught. Professors look for that. And so we've got to have some buy-in there. So there's a lot of work to do, and to get the bodies involved, the players, the constituencies who have an interest in this, to work together on this, and they come to each individual jurisdiction as well. So it's very complex. In my background of the United States, we have 54 jurisdictions over the licensing of certified public accountants. And they are very similar in many ways, but very different in many ways. And trying to find uniformity, accounting education tends to take fairly common ground, but yet there is a great deal of difference as well from graduate to undergraduate and versus and so on. So it is a complex matrix of work that by its complexity, though, should not deter us from trying to work on this, of bringing the parties together, of convening collaborative opportunities to work together toward this, and not by edict, because that's difficult to work with. Educators don't like to be told you must do something, but they I think are want to have their students be successful. So obviously the ability to incorporate this in professional expectations, licensure requirements, and so on will have an impact on the work of accounting educators and institutions at large. And I think that's important because there are major players from that that must buy in for this to be successful.
Okay, I think we'll stop here and move on to the next section. It's actually an excellent question because it's a segue to our next section. And In designing and implementing standards, care needs to be taken so that nature and characteristics of the operation of the market are well understood. Otherwise, the standards are not going to achieve their purpose. To protect the public interest, standards must be proportionate, transparent, non-discriminatory, targeted, implemented consistently and fairly, and subject to regular review. Standard-setting bodies should have a robust governance arrangements and publicly disclose details of their activities. Key aspects of these arrangements include ensuring the design of the standard-setting process includes institutional arrangements that are and are seen to be properly responsive to the public interest, instilling legitimacy and independence into the standard-setting process in order to increase confidence, maintaining the technical competence of the standard-setting process while ensuring that there is sufficiently strong element of public oversight. The following slide is an example of some of accountability relationships that might see in Europe, and one of our panelists will take some time to briefly comment on that. But the question that I'd like to pose to the panelists is the following. What are the accountability relationships and mechanisms relating to the new education standards, and how might they help or hinder their adoption and implementation? Wolfgang, do you have a view on this particular question?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, David. If you could perhaps move back to the previous slide. Jerry just mentioned how complex things are in the US with 54 jurisdictions and so forth. And whenever my American friends complain about how complex things are in the US, then I mention Europe. And I'm not going to try to explain this diagram in detail, but I think this gives you a very good idea of the complexity of the relationships involved. You have European law on the one hand, up at the top, which essentially directs both the European standards, the European Securities Management Authority, and the European Commission to get involved in what is known as the Committee of European Audit Oversight Bodies. You can see the national audit oversight bodies beneath that, the NAOB, and they form this new body known as CEAOB, and they recently have gotten under the directive a responsibility to harmonize the education of statutory auditors in the EU. But the directive also has to be transposed by national governments, which you see on the right-hand side. And they have to do so through national law. These national laws affect the national audit oversight bodies. They affect the national professional accountancy organizations and the universities. On the left-hand side, you can see IFAC and the Statement of Membership Obligations, and of course the Education Standards Board and the new education standards, which are directed at national professional accountancy organizations, but quite frankly, on their own, they're not going to be able to do much because of all of the other stakeholders involved. And so, and you have the firms as well. What we've tried to do as Common Content is to get the national professional accountancy organizations together so that they can come to an agreement on what they believe ought to be the minimum bar for professional accountancy education in Europe. The law, thankfully, does say that the CEOB and the National Audit Oversight Authorities do have to take the harmonization already achieved by the profession into account. But I think this slide shows very clearly how complex the relationships are and that there's going to be a lot of dialogue involved. I'm going to briefly touch on the accountability mechanisms. Because if you actually want to implement IESs, you have to have some form of system in place. That involves a system of governance. You have to have a body that's responsible for the governance of this. You have to develop standards, and I don't mean IESs, I mean more detailed standards that actually implement the IESs, which may include more detailed learning outcomes or a skills framework. You need national professional accountancy bodies and other parties to implement those standards. You need quality control mechanisms because just implementing standards and not having any quality control over that implementation will not help ensure that you in fact are doing a good job of implementing them. You need some form of self-assessment at the end of that process on a periodic basis perhaps to make sure in fact that you have implemented properly, and you need a compliance system that's covered by independent oversight. So I think those are important things to keep in mind when you're designing a system to implement IESs.
Thank you. Jerry, do you have a...
The accountability relationships are obviously can be embedded in legal restrictions or regulations, regulatory with maybe less than laws but more regulatory focus. I think the IESs themselves, I would caution, we want to be careful that those don't get codified as law because they most likely will change. Then we get into very difficult environments for changing things that become law. So obviously referencing or somehow allowing them to stay independent of actually legal status, it would be most appropriate, I think, to try to ensure that these things remain vibrant, relevant, and can be accommodating to what will be, no doubt, a dynamic environment for all of us over the future, because we've already seen that where we are all sitting here today. So the accountability relationships need to be very carefully thought out and to a certain extent driven. I'm a firm believer incentives work better than hammers on the head approach, and so incentivized from the viewpoint of the players finding value in the standards to adopt them, work with them, move forward on them, and extends into a powerful player here in many cases are the employers of professional accounting graduates. And their endorsement and expectation that students will go through their experiences in the initial preparation that reflect the spirit and intent of the IESs. That they're a big player and need to be considered here and need to come on board as well, as many are already participating in this process. So they're part of that as well. So again, finding the forums to bring those various constituents together to work together on this in the various areas will be very, very important and critical for moving forward.
Adrian?
Thank you very much. We all work in a highly regulated environment, whether we're accountants in business, whether we're senior audit partners, whether we're working for ourselves selling accountancy services. Regulation, either through properly constituted regulatory bodies set up for that very purpose or through statute in our various state, regional and local government authorities, bears down on every part of our lives. And I'd like to suggest that the old education standards gave the regulatory community exactly what it wanted, which was a set of relatively easily measured input measures in terms of content of syllabus, in terms of hours of CPD, in terms of almost precisely how examinations would be led. And, that suited the regulators pretty well. It made their job relatively straightforward because clearly they would only grant licenses to accountants and auditors whose learning experience, whose professional qualifications mapped pretty straightforwardly against those input measures. And we've just been talking about how things are a little bit different now. And I think the new education standards pose as great a challenge to the regulatory community as it does to the professional community and our own professional bodies, the universities, the tertiary sector, as Jerry's been mentioning, themselves. Because the regulatory community is going to have to reflect deeply and richly on how it moves into a more sophisticated regulatory environment where it can properly understand the sort of output measures that we've put in place. Now, those of you who might have been watching the development of the standards will know that we haven't gone the whole hog straight away. We have still contained within the standards some indicative input measures and an opportunity for PAOs to use a combination model if they want between inputs and outputs, so that maybe out there, if there's rather an insecure feeling regulatory authority, there still are some very clear guidelines to help them there. But we believe we're on a journey with the regulators, with the employers, and with the wider profession to move over time to a more output-based model.
Edward?
I want to cover two aspects. One briefly relates to one of the stakeholders. You've heard early on there's a number of and a complex relationship dynamic with many stakeholders. But I want to come to the role of the education providers, formal and informal, those who build the capacity. And I think not to underestimate the difficulty and the challenge with the development of a different kind of professional accountant. And if you can imagine a hierarchy of a learning continuum with an ascending level of complexity, it's relatively easy to teach technical knowledge and skill and how to do things that require functional knowledge. Very easy. You can sit in a classroom, you can teach it, you can demonstrate it. Then you move up that hierarchy of complexity. It's a lot harder to teach attributes, to teach critical thinking, to teach professional skepticism and professional judgment. In fact, it requires more than just a talk and chalk environment. It needs to be lived, it needs to be experienced. And therefore, it challenges the traditional educator, the traditional provider, to inculcate those things. And then you move even higher on the hierarchy of complexity to ethical orientation, to values. It's almost impossible to teach. You know, in business, we use the word, you hire for breed and you train for skill. Because you can put, if I can be allowed the latitude, if you can put a donkey on a racehorse program, you'll never turn it into a racehorse. It just becomes a better donkey. And sadly, filtering and understanding what kind of people and individuals the profession needs to attract is very important, because that's really where the DNA begins to set you up for failure or success. So it's building that capacity. The second is a dynamic that, again, lest we call it for what it is, we live in denial. There are inherent conflicts of interests. It's scary when you walk through the corridors to see the number of professional accounting organizations, many of whom are accounting for the same members. So there's a competitive element. There's self-interest. There's self-interest between the professional accountant and the public interest. And very often, in engaging with professional accounting bodies, you can just sense the shift when they are defending the profession and not necessarily mindful of the public interest, although that's an explicit and an implicit dynamic. And therefore, the level of interrelationship and dynamic between all of those various competing organization institutions cannot be underestimated. And somehow we cannot assume that the notion of public interest has a common meaning amongst all of them. And therefore, the debate seeking clarity and shared meaning around what serves the public interest best is important. The third area in this conflict of interest is the notion that boards of directors and executives exert enormous pressure on public and professional accountants. And therefore, setting the tone and defining the culture in an organization is the role of the executive and the governors of such an organization. And one mustn't underestimate how a professional accountant can be sucked into a dynamic or a culture that might incentivize or suggest a particular way of behaving. And if you look at a root cause analysis of those corporate failures, you'll find that it found itself in an unhealthy context where the culture was just, in many cases, despicable. And then lastly, I think mindfulness of the combined assurance framework within which the financial reports are both provided as well as assured. And there, the role of the audit committee is key, reporting directly to the board and not to the CEO. Secondly, the role of executives, both in terms of setting the tone and the direction of the organization, but also managing the functionaries that provides those reports. Thirdly, the independence of the internal providers of assurance who also work for the company. And then lastly, the external provider of assurance. And so managing that dynamics that finally gives you the 4 lines of defense are very, very important. And sometimes we take these things for granted and then wonder why the system loses integrity. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. All right, we'll stop here again. And we're looking for questions from the audience to the panelists, either clarification questions or questions that you would like the opinion of our panelists.
Thanks. So my question goes back to assessment. I think it all is driven to that since you're focusing more on outcome measures now. Looking forward, how do you envision assessment being implemented? Is this going to be done at the national level? Is it going to be done by licensing organizations? I mean, that's kind of important, right? And also, is it going to recognize national differences? Is it going to be customized to the demands in each country? Because the key here is, you know, how's it going to actually be administered? How do you see this going? I can see, for example, in the United States, there's much more detail available now on CPA exam performance, but that doesn't get to all the things you're talking about. It doesn't get to critical thinking or professional skepticism, right? So that also might argue that the licensing exams need to change to recognize the changes as well.
Edward, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no simple answer to that question. I spoke about the challenge of just enforcing and applying it and accepting that the public interest is ultimately only served when the behavior of the professional accountant is impacted on, and an important component thereof is the ability to assess that. And I think, again, standing back, it would be unrealistic to expect that there is one centralized, coordinated effort to ensure that that happens. I think one has to accept that there's a huge interdependence and reliance on a multiplicity of different players. And that's why I think the most important, and hence announcing myself as an activist for the public interest, is allowing that the change starts with myself as a CEO of a listed company in terms of what is the kind of, what position I take and what I stand for. And I think for all of the various role players to sign up for it and to have that relentless pursuit and fanatical discipline that it will not give up until that is reached. And therefore, I would appeal, hence some of the comments earlier on, for greater collaboration, greater sense that there's a huge interdependence that requires regulators, PAOs, providers of education, policymakers, to all sign up to what is it that serves the public interest best, and to work together, step away from their narrow self-interest, and to serve the higher purpose that the profession has been created for. And I don't think there's a simple answer for that because of its complexity and its huge interrelations and interdependencies.
Wolfgang?
Thank you, David. This is an interesting question because this is something we grappled with when we put together our project. I mean, you have to consider getting institutes from the British Isles, Southern Europe, and Northern Europe together at a table to agree on something is not an easy task. We realized that unless we had the appropriate mechanisms in place, which I described very briefly, this simply wasn't going to work. We had to agree on common learning outcomes for all the service areas. And I can tell you there were some knockdown, drag-out fights about this. We had to agree on a mechanism for quality control. We had to agree on a compliance system. We wrote a compliance manual and explained exactly how this would work. It would involve a self-assessment, and then would have an independent expert team go in and check whether, in fact, the learning outcomes that were required were, in fact, implemented in one way or another. And I can tell you that was a difficult process. And we found that we needed oversight, independent oversight, to let the public know that, in fact, yes, we do have this compliance process, and no, we just didn't pat people on the back and say, you did a good job, but we've applied this process fairly. But, I mean, this project has been going on now for 16 years. It took us the first 10 to get agreement on most of these things. So, you know, this is not something that's going to happen quickly. We're thinking here in decades and not in 5 years' time.
Well, you know, the assessment of the higher level learning outcomes that our questioner referred to around professional skepticism, ethical behaviors and so on is, and always has been, incredibly complex. educationalists have struggled, possibly since the Platonic dialogues, with how best to analyze and assess people's development in that framework. But you know, I think technology might be helping us with that. I think that we're going to have to, as educators and as professional accounting organizations, look a lot more at simulations, at experiential assessment models, and it's only going to be through properly utilizing the best that new technology has to offer that we're going to be able to do that on the scale required. I mean, my very good friends in the Indian Institute of Chartered Accountants, of course, have 1 million students. You know, they're not going to be holding 1 million viva voces to properly assess people's own, you know, ethical awareness and standards. They're going to have to get into mass simulation of a way which can properly assess, understand on a sophisticated and critical level those sorts of questions. But I think for us educators, the challenge posed by the questioner will be a lifelong one.
We have a question.
Maybe just a quick concluding comment on that. I think whereas previously it would be a technical assessment, probably done by another accountant, increasingly we will require behavioral assessment models, similar to leadership assessment and other behavioral profiling that you'll require. And as I said early on, I think the important and the highest leverage is to do that assessment even before someone signs up for the profession.
We have a question at the back. Okay. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm aware we had 1 to 8 standards. Now, the new standards, are they just a review of the former 8? Do we have new standards? To what extent has these standards reflect on the practice statements? I will ask later on the specific challenges that we had in respect of IES 2, Content of Professional Accounting Education, and implementation of IEPS 2, titled Professional Accountant, Information Technology for Professional Accountants. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the questioner for that point, because it actually reveals, I think, something about the complexity of what we're trying to do on the Education Standards Board. We know, and colleagues in the room who study these things will know, from looking at the statement of member obligations of the IFAC member bodies around the world, that there are a significant number of IFAC member bodies for whom the existing education standards remain aspirational, where they are still fighting and working hard in order to cope with the demands already placed on them. And now, and I think you've recognized this, sir, in your question, a new set of standards which by their very nature are of a different level of complexity and sophistication have come along, and we need to be extremely cognizant of the differences around the world, around the regions, the differences of resources of professional accounting organizations, the way that they relate to the educational providers in their own jurisdictions, and what we're asking them to do. I know that our facilitator, in fact, is going to be inviting us shortly to reflect on the support and guidance we're going to have to think about and provide to help that gap be bridged colleague professional accountants and PAOs around the world for whom the existing standards are already a challenge. And I think that's something we need to be extremely aware of.
Okay, I think what we'll do at this stage is move on to our third section. Implementation can be thought of as operationalizing the IESs through an enabling environment, sufficient resources, stakeholder participation, advocacy, and governance. The objective of implementation from the Education Standards Board's perspective is to provide guidance and related materials to the member bodies to assist them in supporting implementation by their members and their other stakeholders. Implementation support is demonstrated by 4 different types of activity streams. Availability, which is activity to make the standards and guidance available to the primary target audience, in other words, putting them on our website, making them freely available. Accessibility, activities that are taken to make the standards and guidance accessible in languages other than English, in other words, the translation process. Application support, activity to support other institutions in assisting end users in applying the standards and guidance on a daily basis. So in other words, guidance materials, toolkits we've had in the past. And finally, training and education materials, which is basically activity to support the institutions providing CPD and other universities. Last August, the Education Standards Board released its 2014-2016 Strategy and Work Program. In articulating its strategy, the board recognizes that the public interest is best served at this point in time by the following strategic objectives: promulgating a series of high-quality standards and other publications reflecting good practice in the education development and assessment of professional accountants, promoting the adoption and implementation of the IESs, developing education benchmarks for measuring the implementation of the IESs, and finally, periodically reviewing the need for further revisions to any of the IESs or developing additional standards. Now that the work on the revision of the IESs has been completed, the IESB is turning its focus on supporting an adoption and implementation activity. My question to our panelists are the following. What types of support is needed in implementing the new international education standards? What role can the IASB play in supporting the implementation of the new educational standards? Adrian, do you have a view on this?
Well, I do, David, and thank you very much. But before I say what my opinion is at the moment, when we get to the questions from the floor, you know, I'd like to hear from colleagues in the room, what do you want? What do you want to help you implement the new education standards? Because it may or may not concur with the views you're about to hear from your 4 panelists, but we'll have a go. Well, what type of support is needed? Well, that depends where you are, doesn't it? I mean, we were just reflecting in the last question that we addressed that things are different depending on your jurisdiction, depending on your sector, depending on your professional accounting organization. Edward, in an earlier question, referred to the dynamic tension within the profession whereby professional accounting organizations have private as well as public interests. Let's face it, we compete with one another. And I'm issuing a call to member bodies of IFAC to act with generosity in the public interest, not perhaps to compete so much for members in other people's jurisdictions where there are good, strong, local and growing accounting organizations, but to work with them, to build capacity, to build understanding, to further their activities in the public interest. We need to look beyond our private interest and remind ourselves of the needs of the profession and the public we ultimately serve. Now, that isn't going to be easy for us as professional accounting organizations. I know that only too well. But I think in order to realize the full transformational opportunity, which I believe, offering to the profession now, we're going to have to see if there is some way by which we can meet that challenge. And it may be that our regional accounting associations can help with that. It may be that PAFA, CAPA, FEE in Europe, and the other regional associations can work with us, can be the brokers between the individual professional accounting organizations and the aspiring professional accountant to help us do that and perhaps help filter some of our natural competitive tendencies. And the second part of David's question, of course, was about the role of the Education Standards Board itself. Well, I think, and in a way this is again reflecting on something that Edward said earlier about how chief executives learn and grow and develop, which is if the Education Standards Board is asking for education for accountants to be transformed around the world, we have to transform ourselves too. The board itself is going through a transformational process, moving from being purely a standard setter to being an enabler, a supporter, and a partner around the world with the various stakeholders engaged in international education for accountants. We need to think more about not setting the rules, but providing guidance for how those rules might best be met. And we're working with our incoming chairperson in order to do just that. David's already referred to our upcoming new work program for the board, and if you have the chance to look at that, you'll see that we've really changed the way we're going to work. We're going to be getting out there much more. We're going to be trying to bring together jurisdictions, professional accounting organizations, asking them what help they need instead of simply determining the hoops through which they have to jump.
Wolf.
Thank you. I'm going to depart from the points I was going to make because I think I need to respond to Adrian on this, and I think I'm going to take a somewhat different view than Adrian, just not only to make it interesting. I think, given the points that David had made, I think we're all in agreement that the Education Board has met its responsibility to make standards available to the primary target audience. In terms of accessibility, in terms of languages other than English, I don't think that's something that IFAC can do, or the board. That's not to say that IFAC can't facilitate the process. I am very hesitant about application support and training education materials. And the reason for that is even if the Education Board were to signify something as being non-authoritative, anything that the Education Board issues will be regarded as authoritative. And I think the whole point of a learning outcomes approach is in fact to allow different ways to achieve those learning outcomes. And so if application support and training educational materials are in fact provided, it would actually block the experimentation, exploration, and the different pathways that we talked about previously for different institutions and countries to use different ways to reach the same objective. So I think I just wanted to mention that, and maybe later on we can get onto some of my other points.
Jerry?
From an educational viewpoint, it seems to me that I think without being overly prescriptive, where what's needed, I think, on the educational side is best practice, is to share, is to find strategies or what is working, or to make sure that the best thinking that we have is available for consideration. Not to say you must do it this way, but to provide avenues, tools, or strategies about what best practices have been used elsewhere for consideration in how we carry out a competency-based educational process, assess that for competencies, and rely upon that information for purposes of qualifying professional accountants in the initial context. So obviously, I come from an organization that has been very much about trying to share best practice through its accreditation process, and with some degree of success, and I wouldn't say grand success, but efforts are still underway to continue to do that, to share best practice, not to prescribe, but to offer strategies and opportunities. And one case in point right now is the area of IT skills and this emergence of data analytics and data management, and the challenges that presents, and opportunities as well for accountants and professional accountants, and those who are involved in assurance services and also involved maybe on the managerial side in their firms. There's a wealth of information emerging in that area, particularly as it relates to the accounting area, coming from the multinational firms, and others are beginning to issue, and will soon, or more to come, about the educational expectations for that. There's a lot of information. There are strategies for assessing competency, and you generally, by the time we're talking assessing things like ethics, I think the DNA is set. You're not going to convert someone to be ethical in a college education or a collegiate education, but you can train them to be cognizant of ethical issues and how to deal with those. You can train, and there are strategies and assessment tools for critical thinking, reflective thinking, analytical skills, and so on. Those are out there, and it's a matter of beginning to help people understand what is available. Not that you have to use it, but these are there. So I think the tools and doing the research and being a informational source is a great role in terms of getting implementation. To say you've got standards and then not help you with how can I do this and assess success is, I think we've got to see the IAESB step into that and help us move towards understanding what opportunities are there to do that.
Edward?
Yeah, this is probably the most philosophical I'm going to get this afternoon. Without detracting from the value of programmatic and mechanistic support and scaffolded environments that deliver and build capacity, my own sense as a non-accountant, and having grappled in this world formally through my appointment in the last 4 and a bit years, but just as a business leader, I'm not sure that the profession has a clear enough sense of what the theory of compliance is. And I think it's one of the things that the board itself and IFAC itself grapples with is, what is our sense? What is the theory of compliance? Because depending on our theory of compliance, we'll either build greater enforcement capability and more programmatic avenues of delivery, and we will not necessarily focus on how do we create enabling environments and how do we create more outreach and help and share as opposed to be more competitive. So, I mean, here's a thought that I'm going to leave with you, that it's not good enough to sit in Washington or in London and to say, I'm okay, you know, and that's fine. You know, if you look at the Ebola map, it's a little corner on the extreme west end of Africa. That's actually where the issue is located. But the rest of the world recognizes it as a global crisis and is managing it as such. So if we sit in London or in Johannesburg or in Lagos and say, I'm okay, and we're not mindful that a threat to the integrity or a risk to the accounting profession anywhere is a threat to public interest everywhere. And therefore, we need to drop our guard. We need to approach this as a systemic, as a cultural revolution, and almost as something that we need to evangelize. And you can't look to only a POA. You can't look to IFAC or the ISB. Every single one of us in the room have to take up arms against practices that are unethical, practices that detract from the integrity of the profession. I cannot tell you both as an investor and as a business leader, how reliant I am on the work of professional accountants. And therefore, I, more than anyone, place the gold standard at the highest possible level. And I think that's what the standards seek to achieve, that's the gold standard. But it requires every single of the 4,000 odd accountants who gather here over the next few days to accept that as the gold standard, to go out there and to evangelize that, to be absolutely relentless and have a zero tolerance to any other professional who seeks to detract, who seeks to take shortcuts, or who draws unethical practices as part of this profession. So unless we accept that, we're going to fail in this cultural revolution. And that's the plea that I would make. So I think 2 points specifically. One is to expand the notion that this is the gold standard. It may change in the future, but for now, this is the gold standard that everyone must sign up to if you have an interest in the profession. And secondly, to facilitate more outreach, and IASB specifically is leading this charge to ensure that capability and capacity expands, that it's shared generously, and that we look over our fences and not live in a gilded cage that believes we've protected. Because actually, the way we're going to solve this is by becoming more aware and more involved in those that are across the borders, across the fences, and accept that that is also our accountability. Thank you.
Wolfgang, I know we haven't won you over, but I know you have a few words left. Go ahead.
If I might, I would like to reflect on Jerry's comments in relation to Adrian's, because I thought they spoke to slightly different things. And Jerry, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard you say something to the effect that the IASB could gather the information as to how good practices in implementing IISs are carried out. And I think that would be something useful, because I think there are a lot of institutions, I'm thinking of some of the professional bodies in the British Isles, in North America, the Common Content Project, and so forth, that are actually in the process of implementing the new IISs. Processes, I think, that would provide material that might be of interest to other bodies that want to go down this route as well. But I think it would, providing that sort of information would also demonstrate there are different ways of doing this. And this is something different than actually coming up with some application support or training education material that is then viewed as best practice, that then limits the various means by which you might implement IISs.
All right, we'll stop here again, and we'll ask for questions from the audience. Sir. No, yes?
I have a question that relates to all the sessions. One is it desirable or good to harmonize or to create consistency between profession and university? Because we see that these two have two different goals and follow different targets. I see. Who could play, if it is, if you are agree with this, who could play this role? University or profession or other person? I don't know. One question was it. The second subject I want to focus on it. Technical expertise and education that you said, I think should not be overlooked. It is a prerequisite. I think you are agree with me. Is it or acceptable to have analysts that are not dominant in technical subjects? Is it good in profession? Who should start? I think we should start from technical training and experiences, and continual professional education helps us to reach to other steps like critical thinking and solving problems and other issues. But it is not acceptable, I think, that one auditor or professional that is not dominant in technical skills. In the community, it is not accepted, I think. I want to know your views, if it is possible. Thank you very much.
I can quickly respond to the last point. Absolutely agree with you. The emphasis on professional and behavioral attributes and orientation does not replace the need to be technically competent. I think that's the ticket to the game, not the game itself. So just to make the point that the technical competency of a professional accountant, whether he is a provider or an assurance role, absolutely requires him to understand his stuff. But what we are saying is that beyond that, we know that the differentiating attributes is not his technical or her technical competencies, but their ethical orientation, their critical thinking, their judgment, etc.
Question number one, between university and profession, who should harmonize these two? Because I teach in university and I am professional in audit firm, I see that these two follow different goals. Who should harmonize? Is it possible? Is it required? Is it appropriate? What is your view?
It is a view. I think if you have to legislate it, it won't work. Because, and that's why my point that unless all of the parties have a stake in, who have a stake in this, believe that they act in the higher purpose, the higher and common good, they will continue to define their agenda by their narrow self-interest. And that's my point earlier on. To say that we are okay and the problem is out there is a fallacy, because ultimately the problem is yours as well. It's the, you know, the story about understanding that that a threat anywhere is also a threat to you, and therefore you act as if that's your own threat. But you can't legislate it, you cannot regulate it. The different role players have to accept collective responsibility, and that must bring them to the table to talk. But as Wolf and others have said, I don't underestimate that because of the natural tendency to resort to your narrow self-interest.
Go ahead.
Well, you know, the harmonizer is going to vary depending on where you are. In some jurisdictions, of course, we know that the professional accounting organization is dominant in terms of setting and even sometimes delivering professional accounting education. We know that elsewhere the PAO merely advises and the tertiary sector takes the lead. In other jurisdictions, again, of course, the licensing authorities hold the whip hand and largely determine what takes place in terms of accounting education. So in terms of that simple but actually very complex question, sir, I think it will depend on all sorts of factors, and particularly in terms of who really sets the goals to entry to the profession.
I spoke earlier about the experiences we had in the Common Content Project. One of the issues here is to gain a critical mass. If you have enough professional accountancy bodies that are able to persuade the other stakeholders in their jurisdiction that this is the right way to go, and you achieve a critical mass of countries in a certain area, then other countries will follow. So, but this is a painful, long process. This is not something that's going to happen overnight.
Just last point, David. I referred early on to a revolution, and I'm absolutely serious about that. But just think about this. Revolutions never start with the ruling class. Revolutions never start with those in power. And that is why my appeal to every single professional accountant must own this and must become activists and drive this and not think that it's some power or some mechanism or some authority that's going to make this happen. I mean, my sense and understanding of human behavior is this is a lot harder than what we think and made almost impossible when we resort to narrow self-interests. And hence my appeal. It is a revolution that's required, and it requires every single one of you in the room who purport to love and to stand for this profession to stand up and to be counted.
Sir.
I have a question. I really don't think that the problem of the accountants is education in general. I mean, all the accountants that are here present, or they are working on their own, are thriving to keep up with the technology and with the rules and everything. I think the major problem, the major challenge that is facing the accounting is the independence. The independence. How to be independent in providing the insurance. And as long as we didn't find a solution to this independence question, whereby the company is paying the auditor to provide his insurance, and the major problems that the accountancy profession has known stems from this failure of independence thing. We know that what happened with Arthur Andersen before, this is mainly because they were paid a huge amount of fees by their clients, and so they will not provide that integrity that you are talking about. So as long as we are paid by the ones we are supposed to provide the service, it's a very tough question. I don't think it goes beyond education itself.
So I'm going to make a few points, and none of them necessarily agree with you. The first point is, I have met professional accountants, those who do my external audit, that are fiercely independent, even they know their reappointment will depend on me. I respect them for that. Independence is a professional orientation that you have that has no regard for the consequence of your behavior. If you don't know what you stand for, you'll fall for anything. I personally have offered my resignation in matters where I cannot, with authenticity, execute someone else's decision. And you have to ask, what are you afraid of losing? And it can't be worth standing for if you're afraid of the consequences thereof. It's a tough response, but it's the only response I can give you in good conscience. The second point, interestingly, when I started doing a preparation for a speech to one of our professional bodies in South Africa about 10 years ago, I did some research and came across that when public accountants were introduced first, the state paid for them, not the company. And I think that was a recognition that the person must be supported in that independence, and that, I guess, has sympathy with your view that the average human being will be seduced, influenced, under some influence. But I come back to my first point. If you don't know what you stand for, you'll fall for anything.
All right. What I'd like to do is, to conclude the session, I'm conscious of your time, and it's just about 2:30. So first of all, I'd like to thank our panelists. We've had an excellent session this afternoon in terms of engagement back and forth. So please give them a hand.